Good afternoon. You can slowly get your seats. Can you hear me all okay? My name is Niels Roma. I'm the director of the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Alumni Center and to UT Dallas. Today's lecture marks yet another one of the famous Einspruch lectures. So it has gone to sleep here apparently. Doesn't matter, which has existed now for almost 20 years. But I think today's lecture in many ways in our minds marks also what would have been a very torturous and painful weekend, considering the shooting that had occurred yesterday. And it just made me realize this morning when I was thinking about this, that in lots of ways our worlds are so immensely connected that I wasn't at all surprised that amongst our faculty is actually a member of that synagogue in Pittsburgh who has taught here for many years math in the School of Engineering, William Perman, who sits right there. So our worlds, in other words, are touched in unfortunate ways at times, as we are once again this year honoring the memory of the Holocaust by the way of inviting yet another distinguished lecturer who will shortly address you. But I think in the midst of this, it's very easy at times to feel almost a little bit overwhelmed. And I think a good way of thinking about our task and obligation to remember and to continue to study the past is to think about the Mishnah, which says, it is not upon us, we are not obligated to complete the task, but we're equally not freed to liberate ourselves from the burden and from the task of remembrance. So we have to understand that in many ways, most of the things that we do and many of the things that we cherish are required of our ongoing attendance and of our ongoing engagement. And therefore, I'm all the more pleased to see as many of you here today. You will have realized that we were hopeful, but that you surprised us, and therefore we had to open up the second part. So thank you all for being here. Let me now welcome to the stage the president of UT Dallas, Dr. Richard Benson. Thank you.
Thank you, Nils. Wise words. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to UT Dallas. It is an honor to host this lecture series that is supported by an endowment created 16 years ago. Both the endowment and the series are named for Burton Einspruch, a chairman emeritus of the Ackerman Center Advisory Board, and I believe he's here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Einspruch. Other special guests include the founder of the Holocaust Studies program, the incomparable Zsuzsanna Oszwath. Let's see, where was I? We passed board chair, Mr. Selibalowski. He's here somewhere. Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities, Dennis Kratz. And Executive Vice President Hobson Wildenthal. Most of you here are familiar this evening with the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies. While the Ackerman Center has existed, now it says 12 years, I know it's longer than that. Programs in Holocaust studies go back for more than 3 decades. These programs owe their existence to the vision of Dr. Oszwath. She deserves much credit for using her personal journey as a Hungarian Jewish Holocaust survivor to create a focus on the history and legacy of one of the most tragic epochs in world history. Sadly, the lessons that our society should have learned from the Holocaust continue to challenge us, and we at UT Dallas stand in solidarity with our friends in Pittsburgh. It is important for me to publicly state that we respect diversity and we strive to be a campus that honors all people. So we are indeed fortunate that Dr. Oszwath continues to teach and inspire us to shape a better future through rigorous scholarship and community engagement. Thank you, Zsuzsi. Holocaust studies at UT Dallas attract a broad range of university students, including some that earn a certificate in Holocaust studies. The demographics of those who are part of the program mirror those of our broader university population. UT Dallas is in the top 25 nationally for the most diverse student populations, and you will find the same diversity among those enrolled in Holocaust Studies courses. Please indulge me as I highlight some additional points of pride about UT Dallas. We have a few guests here. We have been designated as a R1 research institution by the Carnegie classification. We are one of 3 public universities in Texas to be eligible for state support through the National University Research Fund. We are the 4th fastest growing public doctoral university in the country. This fall, we have our largest student body, 28,757 students, and 2/3 are undergraduates. We have a record freshman class, 3,866, and of those freshmen, 172 are National Merit Scholars. A year ago, when we had 152, that was the 3rd largest total in the country. So we're pretty sure we're still in a good spot. And finally, next year, we will celebrate our 50th year as part of the University of Texas system. In a moment, I will turn over the program to Dr. David Patterson, but first I want to share a few things about our introducer. Dr. Patterson was previously a speaker at this very lecture. In 2010, the university wisely brought him aboard as a Hillel A. Feinberg Chair in Holocaust Studies. I also understand that he played football for the famed Permian High School Panthers, the Odessa team featured in the book Friday Night Lights. So again, to you all, welcome to our campus, and now it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Patterson to the podium.
Thanks so much, Dr. Benson. Thank you for getting that part in about Odessa Permian High School. That's significant. You wouldn't believe it, but I played guard. We were smaller back then. Anyway. Yes, we have to the crucial matter at hand. I also need to mention, in the light of the events of yesterday in Pittsburgh, the importance of the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, the things that we do. We study not just the Holocaust, but anti-Semitism, ways in which the road to Auschwitz were paved. Was paved, and we do have a unique center here at UT Dallas and the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, unique in the country and I would say in the world. One of the extraordinary things that we do is to have world-class scholars come to UTD for the Einspruch lecture series. And if you look at the past scholars who have been here, that tells you that I'm not exaggerating. These are indeed world-class scholars, and Peter Hayes is at the top of the world-class scholars in Holocaust studies today. Professor Hayes was the Theodore Zev Weiss Holocaust Educational Foundation Professor of Holocaust Studies, Emeritus, at Northwestern University, where he taught for 36 years. He is the author or editor of 12 books. There's the award-winning Industry and Ideology, I.G. Farben in the Nazi Era. He's famous for his work with a biannual conference called Lessons and Legacies. He's published numerous collections out of Lessons and Legacies. He's a co-editor with John Roth of the Oxford Handbook of Holocaust Studies. He's also the editor of the anthology, How Was It Possible? A Holocaust Reader. And his most recent book in print is called Why? Explaining the Holocaust, which will be the subject of his remarks tonight. And he's of course, like all great scholars, still working. He's working on a volume with Stephen Lindner of Munich called Prophets and Persecution, German Big Business in the Third Reich. I should add that Professor Hayes is not only a noted award-winning scholar, he's a noted award-winning teacher. In fact, today he had lunch with a former student who came all the way from Austin to have lunch. He is the winner of Northwestern University's highest honor for teaching, the Charles Deering McCormick Professorship of Teaching Excellence, and he's won several other awards for his outstanding teaching. So it's all great and excellent to be among the great scholars, but we also need great teachers. Peter Hayes is to be counted among the great teachers. He was here for a teacher's workshop for us, in fact. And finally, just this month, I believe, Professor Hayes received the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's National Leadership Award. And since I know you came to hear Professor Hayes, I won't go through his whole CV, which would take a considerable amount of time. But please join me to welcome Peter Hayes.
Thank you for your invitation, and thank you all for coming. As I was coming up to my retirement 2 years ago, I realized I was in a position to write not only a new history of the Holocaust, but a new kind of history of the Holocaust. And I was in this position not because of any special genius on my part, but because I had taught at Northwestern for 36 years. And in 25 of those years, I taught a course on the history of the Holocaust. Northwestern operates on something called the quarter system. It should be called the drawn and quartered system. What you have here is real college with semesters. At Northwestern, we have 11-week units, 3 of them, to teach a subject, except it's not 11 weeks. 1 week is reserved for final exams, down to 10. Another week is reserved for the students to do the reading that they should have been doing in the preceding weeks. You're down to 9. And you got to give a midterm exam. I had 8.5 weeks to teach the history of the Holocaust. My whole educational career, I operated on the semester system, except for 2 years at Oxford, where they have 9-week terms. But they don't do lectures at Oxford, and it's all tutorials, and it's an entirely different world. So I came into this assignment in the late 1980s, sort of trying to apply my past to my present function. And that meant I kept trying to fit things I had studied in like 13 or 14 or 15-week units into 8.5 weeks. This is the proverbial blanket that is too small for the bed. You pull it one way, and your feet are cold. You pull it the other way, and your shoulders are cold. And this is a subject with long antecedents and a very complicated past, and the subject itself is intricate. And I had to try to fit this into 8.5 weeks. Well, the first few years I floundered around, and I had no idea quite how to do it, so I failed in different ways in the first few years. And then I suddenly realized I should do something, and I hope I'm not going to offend anybody here. I should do something that I don't necessarily normally recommend as a good practice. I should listen to my students. Because in the first years, I taught all the discussion sections myself. So on every Friday afternoon, I would do 3 or 4 of these, and I would actually be able to ask people, why are you taking this course? What do you want to learn from this? What do you expect to learn from this? And I would get a series of things that they would tell me about. And I realized after a while, I wasn't real quick picking this up, but I realized after a while that the central things they came into the class wanting to know were almost exactly the questions I got when I went out and talked to adult audiences about the Holocaust. There was a tremendous overlap between these questions that they posed before they even started with the subject. And the penny dropped. And I said, well, that's what I should do. Organize each week around one of these questions. That's how I can pack the material in a framework that will interest people, that will allow me to get away from the sort of one event after another, tell the story from beginning to end, and fit it into 8.5 weeks. What were the questions? What did people keep asking me all the time? Why the Jews? Why was this group of people attacked so vehemently? Why the Germans? If you had asked people in Europe in 1912, in 30 years, what nationality in this country on this continent is going to be killing Jews and burning their bodies? The answer in the aftermath of the pogroms of the 1880s or the Dreyfus Affair would have been Russia or France. Very few people would have predicted Germany. Why murder? If the attack on this group of people was to take place, why did the Nazis want to kill them? There are lots of other ways of getting rid of people you don't like. Why were they so successful? We tend to think that the Holocaust killed 2/3 of the Jews of Europe, 6 million out of 9 million in 1939. In fact, the German record was far worse than that. The Germans killed between 75 and 80% of the Jews they ever got their hands on. The other survivors are people who were out of their lines, beyond their reach. This is a remarkable, quote-unquote, accomplishment on their part. And they did it in an incredibly compressed period of time. Half the victims of the Holocaust died in a period of 11 months, from March of 1942 to February of 1943. Over 3 million people. 3/4 of the victims of the Holocaust died between the invasion of Poland and the German surrender at Stalingrad. So this is a remarkably rapid carnage carried out with remarkable efficiency. How is that possible? Why didn't more Jews fight back? This is, of course, the question that I found most upsetting in dealing with students, because it's a question that comes out of living in a comfortable, liberal society. Maybe it comes out of growing up in a state where the image of the Alamo is so powerful, and we think human beings have the capacity to individually assert themselves against power. So why didn't more Jews stand up? How come the survival rates vary so much? 75% of the Jews of the Netherlands were killed. 25% of the Jews of France. 95% of the Jews of Lithuania. 20% of the Jews of Romania as of the beginning of the war. Why is there so much variation? Why did Jews get so little help? How is it that the Nazi state was able to attack them with this kind of intensity and virtually nobody came to their aid? And finally, what lessons and legacies are we to draw from this? What is the meaning of this subject for us in the contemporary world? These are the 8 questions that I gradually distilled out of what people said to me and what my students asked. So I got to the ripe old age of 70. I was approaching the ripe old age of 70 and thinking maybe a course which I had shaped in this way would be useful to present to a wider audience. And so this book, Why? Explaining the Holocaust, is a book with 8 chapters. 7 of the chapters are the same length, and one of them has 3 sections instead of 2. That's the half in the 8.5 weeks. And I turned this course into a book in hopes that it would, am I not loud enough? It sounds like you're breaking up with me. You think it's us, not me? Okay. I've used that line. Anyway, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, so I constructed this book with these 8.5 chapters and so forth, and that's what is now I'm bellowing. Is this okay? Better? All right. So, I mean, I can yell. So what I did is I turned this course into a book, and now what I want to do with you this evening is to give you a flavor of, I obviously can't go through all 8 questions and so forth, and you might go to sleep on me, but I will give you a flavor of the argument and a sense of how I proceed by looking at 2 central questions. Why were Jews killed? And why didn't anybody stop it? Now, the question, why were Jews killed, obviously goes back a very long way to a tradition in Christianity of regarding Jews as contaminating, potentially undermining the faith of Christians. After all, Jews are the people who said no. Christ came into the world with a promise of new revelation, a new relationship with God, and Jews are the people who said, thank you very much, we already have one. And we do not wish to adopt the new one. Christians then began to erect, not immediately, but over time, began to erect a series of ways of keeping Jews at arm's length. Occupational restrictions, residential restrictions, the whole point of which was Jews must not be allowed to come into too close contact with Christians, lest they undermine the faith of the Christians. And this is a tradition that dominated Western history from the end of the Roman Empire, roughly 400 of the Common Era, to roughly the end of the 18th century. And beginning at the end of the 18th century, rulers began to release Jews from all these restrictions that had been created. The movement was called emancipation. It began with the Emperor of Austria in 1782, who declared that Jews should be made useful like all other citizens. Now, from the point of view of the emperor, you know what useful meant? Taxable. And so Jews should be released from all these restrictions so they could flourish and prosper like everyone else, so that they could give off revenue for the state. 20 years later, the armies of the French Revolution, now propelled by different motivations, human rights, individual freedom, so forth, the armies of the French Revolution spread across Europe, and everywhere they opened the gates of the ghettos, they tore down the restrictions on what Jews could do and where they could live and how they could be separated from the rest of the population. Now, the movement that we nowadays call anti-Semitism, a word, incidentally, that didn't exist until 1879. The movement that we now call anti-Semitism was a reaction against emancipation. It was a political movement designed to put the Jews back in the boxes that they had been in. Why? Because freedom for some can mean losses for others. Jews were now allowed to enter into society in a way that they never had been allowed to before. And enter into means to compete, to go to university. And if there's a limited number of university places, and Jews can now take some of them, there are people who feel that they are losing out. Jews also were emancipated at a time of enormous economic change, in which whole professions disappeared. We tend to think of the Industrial Revolution as this great period of expansion of opportunity and so forth, and it was. And of rising incomes over time, it was. But whole categories of people lost their livelihoods. How many of you know what a cooper is? I'm noticing that the younger people don't. A cooper is a barrel maker. And it's a common name in English because there used to be lots of people who made barrels, like a shoemaker. The Industrial Revolution put these people out of business. And so there was an audience out there for agitators who said, things are going bad for you. And you know why? Because things are going well for these newcomers. These people who have been emancipated and who have new opportunities, they are, in some cases, not all, but in some cases they're flourishing. And meanwhile, you're not doing so well. And these things are not just a correlation, they're causally related. The movement of 19th century anti-Semitism was a movement that kept telling people who were losing out that we know why. It's not because of some abstract process, it's not because of economic change, it's not because factories have arisen and so on and so forth, it's because they're doing this to you. Who benefits? Is the famous slogan of agitators, cui bono. And they would say, anything going wrong for you is caused by the people who are doing well. Now this was the lifeblood of 19th century anti-Semitism. In every European country, there were people who were only too quick to come forward and say, we know what's ailing you, and we know how to fix it. We put these people back in a box, and you will have the opportunities you used to have. Now, the remarkable thing about this movement in the 19th century is it was loud, was vocal. It was characteristic of virtually every European country. It never went away, and politically, it was a marginal phenomenon. No major anti-Semitic agitator across the continent became a decisive leading political figure, with the single exception of the Lord Mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, who got elected in the 1890s and served for roughly 20 years. But the year he got elected, a Jew got elected to be the Lord Mayor of Budapest. So there were counter-examples and so forth. There was always enough of an audience for anti-Semitism to be constant and vocal, but not enough for it to succeed. And a place where it was particularly vocal and particularly unsuccessful was Germany before World War I. There were a host of anti-Semitic political parties that came and went. They never got more than 4% of the vote in a parliamentary election. They never got more than 5% of the seats in parliament. As of 1912, the last election before World War I, flash forward 20 years. 1932, Adolf Hitler is getting 37% of the vote. It's a long way from 5%. What happened? What makes this marginal political movement into suddenly a menacing force in German political life and about to be the dominant party in the state? The short answer is World War I and its effects on Germany. But the primary answer is the way in which Germans processed these effects after the war. They regarded their defeat as unfair. They regarded the peace that was imposed upon them as entirely different than the basis on which they had surrendered. Because in 1918, the Germans agreed to an armistice on the basis of Woodrow Wilson's promise of a peace without annexations and without indemnities. And then, 8 months later, they got the Versailles Treaty, which had annexations and indemnities. And then there were a series of catastrophes that followed. In 1923, the German currency inflated to the point that it was worth 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. It literally was not worth the paper it was printed on. And then that situation was stabilized, and in 1930, the Depression hit Germany. And it hit Germany harder than any other country in the world. The stock market fell further than even in the United States. The unemployment rate went up higher than it was in the United States. Gross national product fell further, and we were hit probably the second hardest country in the world. There was a series of catastrophes which increased that audience for an agitator who came along and said, "This is not your fault. I know who did this to you." Hitler spoke to the Germans in a way that was simultaneously flattering. You deserve better than this. You are the best people on the globe. You did not create this situation. And made excuses for them and said, I know who did this to you. The Allies did this to you with the Versailles Treaty. The communists did this to you because there was a left-wing uprising in 1918 that overthrew the emperor. And the Jews did this to you because the Jews are the wire pullers behind all of these phenomena. This is the ideology that Hitler peddled, and the thing that was so potent, something for us to remember perhaps today, is that the willingness to be brutal to others often begins with a sense that somebody has already been brutal to you. Victimization is a very dangerous feeling, because once people conclude that they have been victimized, they feel entitled to lash back anyway. They feel entitled to do anything to the supposed victimizers because it's just self-defense. We didn't start this, and this is the way the Nazis sold their ideology to the Germans. You've been robbed, you've been cheated. The phrase in German is belogen und betrogen, lied to and deceived. This is what they've done to you. You have to stand up and fight back, and all means are legitimate because they did it first. And this is the method, this is what Hitler did. Now, it's important to realize that this was a potent message in Germany in the 1920s, but it was not a message that won over a majority. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, roughly 55% of the Germans had never voted for him. He was jobbed into power by a coalition of powerful people around the president. He did not have a majority support in the parliament. He did not have a majority support in the cabinet. He had 3 Nazis out of 12 seats. This is very important to realize because though the potential was there in the German public, enough to make him the biggest party in the country, even though he believed terrible and terribly simplified things, was not enough to give him a majority. The Nazis turned that society into a murderous society after they acquired power. This illustrates the very important proposition that power magnifies the ideas of those who hold it. Once Hitler came into power, he was able to use the force of the state, legitimate legal means, other forms of pressure to gradually turn the nation into a one-party dictatorship. And not only a one-party dictatorship that was willing to do things to people that Nazi ideology said it should do. Germany descended in the 1930s into an orgy of belonging, in which Germans defined themselves as morally different from everybody else in the world. The teaching of the party was life is eternal struggle. They will get you unless you get them first. Your moral obligations are only to people just like us, we, and you have no moral obligations to them. The golden rule goes out the window. It will just make you weak in the struggle among nations. What matters, what is right, what is good for Germany. And what is wrong and what is bad is what is bad for Germany. It was this simple moral calculus that divided the world between us and them. And the Nazis had a monopoly on discussion of this. There was one voice relentlessly telling Germans that this is the way the world is. And through a combination of intimidation, indoctrination, and intoxication, the Nazis forged a society that was willing to murder people. The intimidation is, of course, the threat of concentration camps. If you buck us, if you challenge us, you know what could happen to you. The indoctrination is I'll give you an illustration of the indoctrination. There are 2 that are particularly powerful. Beginning in 1933, any German law student who was preparing to take the law boards, the German equivalent of law boards, had to go to boot camp in the summer to be trained in Nazi ideology. Any applicant for a teaching certificate to go have a teaching job in an elementary school or a middle school or a high school had to do the same thing. These summer camps were quasi-military institutions where everybody was drilled, and everybody was both physically drilled, marching, and then drilled in Nazi ideology. And the intoxication came from the fact that Hitler achieved some successes. By 1936, Germany had recovered from the Depression, had more than full employment, was bringing in workers from the outside, mostly from Poland. The Depression was over. Virtually everyone had a job who wanted one. By 1936, the country had rearmed so that it could say our military might is equal to that of our neighbors, and we did this without firing a shot. By 1936, German forces had marched into the demilitarized Rhineland, and they had reunited the Saarland with the Reich. They were on the verge of further diplomatic victories, such as the unification of Austria with Germany and so forth. Everywhere people looked, even critics of Hitler had to admit, you know, he's accomplished some things. Of course, there's been a price. Socialists have been arrested and sent to concentration camps. Jews have been marginalized from the society, and many of them have been driven to emigrate. But you know, as the German proverb goes, wo gehobelt wird, fallen Späne. Where you plane, there are wood shavings that fall to the floor. This is the price you have to pay for success. And this was what happened in the course of the 30s. Now the problem or the situation that turned this society, which had now been primed to act on Nazi ideology, into a society that would kill, was almost a matter of mathematics. The Nazis realized in the course of 1938 that they were pursuing two central goals that were contradictory. One goal, the expansion of Germany so that it would acquire ever more living space. Hitler believed that Germans needed more territory in order to support themselves and produce enough food and so forth. So the first objective was living space. But the second objective, the Nazis taught, is that we cannot expand successfully. We cannot compete with other nations as long as there are Jews within our lines. Because Jews are the eternal enemy. They are subversives. They will be the fifth columnists. I know that's I bet everybody in the room over 50 knows what a fifth columnist is, and almost nobody under 50 knows what a fifth columnist is. It's a saboteur behind the lines. The Nazis defined the Jews as this. The Nazis blamed the Jews for Germany losing in World War I. And they said, we cannot be successful in the next conflict unless we get rid of them. But every time the Nazis expanded, they acquired more Jews. And when they took Austria in 1938 and the Sudetenland in late 1938, in just those two steps, they acquired almost as many Jews as they had succeeded in driving out of Germany between 33 and 38. And they looked at the horizon and they knew the next target was what is called today the Czech Republic, where there were 150,000 Jews. And after that, they wanted living space in Poland, where there were 3.3 million Jews. And after that, they wanted Ukraine, where there were 1.5 to 2 million Jews. They could not drive Jews out of Germany as fast as they acquired more Jews through expansion. And what this did is, in the course of 1938, Nazi policymakers actually began to talk about what they were doing in a different way. Up until then, if you look at Hitler's speeches, if you look at the Goering speeches and what they said to Germans, they said, our goal is the removal of Jews from Germany. In German, that word is Entfernung. The Jews were to be entfernt, removed. And that was the word always used. And beginning in 1938, in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, leaders of the Nazi state begin to use a new word. They always use it in sentences that go something like this. If all the Jews don't leave, if other nations don't take the Jews, if it comes to another war in Europe, then the result will be die Vernichtung der Juden, the annihilation of the Jews. In other words, the idea of removal, which always had meant expulsion, maybe deportation, now they begin actually to give voice to the thought that they're going to kill people. And not just kill individual people, all of them. Vernichtung is a totalizing word. And this basically is the moment of pivoting in Nazi policy in the aftermath of the Kristallnacht. They prophesy, and Hitler does it to the German Reichstag on January 30th, 1939. He says, if it comes to a new world war, that will mean the annihilation of the Jews in Europe. Well, in the course of 1939 and 1940, all of these conditional prophecies came true. The Jews could not get out of Germany, all of them, because most other countries wouldn't take very many. It did come to war. The Jews were impoverished. And at that moment, in 1941, as all of these things become true, the Nazi leaders decide that the implication of what they have been saying is here. They cannot drive the Jews out. They cannot ship the Jews out. They must, in fact, kill them. And they do this in two steps. The first step is when they are about to invade the Soviet Union, they decide that we're not going to do in the Soviet Union what we did in Poland, which is round the Jews up and put them in ghettos and then deal with the issues of how much to feed them and how to prevent epidemics from breaking out and so on and so forth. We're just going to bring death to the Jews as we march in. And so what happens in the Soviet Union in 1941 is the reverse of what happens in Poland in 1939. In 1939, most of the Jews in Poland were rounded up and put in cities, and a minority of them were killed. In 1941, in the Soviet Union, it's the opposite. Almost everybody is killed as the Germans arrive. They have these shooting units, the Einsatzgruppen, and then they send police units and SS units, and they kill roughly 1 million people between the invasion at the beginning. They start killing at the beginning of July and the end of January 1942. So that's the first step. And then the second step is they realize that they can not only bring death to the Jews in their path, they can bring the Jews they already control to death. Because in the summer of 1941, it dawns on the leaders of the Nazi Party that they already have two methods of killing large numbers of Jews en masse. The first is the method of gassing people with carbon monoxide that the Germans used against the handicapped people in German mental institutions from 1939 to 1941. And they begin to transfer the personnel at these mental institutions to the eastern border of Poland, where they become the staff for the camps that are Belchec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and also the one that was in the annexed German territories, Chelmno. These people have experience with applying carbon monoxide. They know how to do it. And in the next 2 years, beginning with Chelmno in December of 1941 and running into 1943, at those 4 camps, they kill over 2 million people with carbon monoxide. And then they realize that they have one other method, that at most German military installations and most U-boats, I guess the best illustration of this is a U-boat. In Chicago, we have a U-boat. This seems unlikely, Chicago being in the middle of the country. But at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, you can go and visit a U-boat. You can walk in it and walk through it and so forth. It's incredibly tiny. I mean, the full length of it is from that wall to this wall. And it's incredibly compressed. The first thing that happened to a U-boat when it came back into harbor in Germany is the crew would get off, the hatches would be open at each end, the crew would get off, and men with a full rubber suit would walk in at each end with a can, looks about like that. And they would pop that can with what in my day was called a church key. I don't know, does that translate anymore? Okay. And they would pop that can with 2 openings. The can contained Zyklon, which is hydrocyanic acid. It's a liquid that is in absorbent pellets. When they come in contact with oxygen at a temperature above 70 degrees, they vaporize. And the vapor, 1/33rd of an ounce, if you can grasp that. I can't even imagine what 1/33rd of an ounce is. But the whiff of 1/33rd of an ounce of that vapor will kill a 150-pound person within 2 minutes. That's Zyklon. It was used on the U-boat, and it was used in barracks to fumigate them, to kill lice that accumulated. I mean, after all, if you're under the water of the North Sea with 25 guys at close quarters in a boat for a month and a half, it certainly needs fumigating when it comes home. And that's what Zyklon was used for. And the transfer of that to the killing of people occurs at Auschwitz in September of 1941 when an instruction comes down. Prepare a method for disposing of large numbers of ill inmates. And the SS people who receive this think the ill inmates are going to be Soviet prisoners of war who are brought in there. In fact, and so they say, well, we have this stuff. It's in a storage room over here. We know it's lethal. Let's see how it works. And they confine 600 Soviet prisoners of war to the basement of one of the barracks at Auschwitz. It has kind of a recessed cantilevered windows at the bottom. They open the window, they pop the can, they throw it in, they close the window, and they wait to see what happens. This is September 1941. And they discover that it's very efficient at killing people, although it would be better if the basement did not have dividing walls, if it was all wide open, because the gas would disperse better. And that was it. By September 1941, they knew that we can kill all of the Jews that are behind our lines by gathering them together, putting them on trains or trucks, and sending them to places that will administer these treatments. They have the method, they have the opportunity, the motive, the opportunity, and the means. So why didn't anybody stop this? Once it was in motion, why didn't anybody stop it? The shootings in Russia, the gassings, and so forth. Well, there are 3 answers, I think. Because the Jews themselves were internally divided and largely powerless. Everyone else always had something more important to do. And the Nazis developed a fast process of killing at installations that were out of reach of anybody interfering. Now, let me take that last point first, because this is one of the most disputatious aspects of the study of the Holocaust. Why wasn't Auschwitz bombed, is usually the way the question goes. The first thing to remember is that the death camps were situated on the, well, let's see if I can do this with your imagination. Look at my nose, okay? Let us assume that my nose is located at the exact geographical midpoint of the European continent, okay? Now, you know, if I did this for the continental United States, my nose would be Topeka, right? We're all agreed about that? All right, if we do this for the continental Europe, my nose is Vienna. All right, draw a line up from Vienna. Draw a line this way from Vienna. What you've done is you've marked off the northeast quadrant of the European continent. 3/4 of the victims of the Holocaust came from there. 90% of the victims of the Holocaust died there. Okay? Keep your mind fixed on this. The closest Allied aircraft, and this is where all the death camps are, the closest Allied aircraft to that are here. This is the British Isles. See the fist? I'm actually of Irish descent. I like to do this. All right? Now, in the course of the Second World War, no aircraft could ever fly from here to those death installations and get back to here on a full tank of gas. None. Never. The only time we became capable of hitting a death camp was from here, the Italian boot. And we didn't reach the point at which you could launch aircraft from Italy and get to the last remaining death camp, which is Auschwitz, until July of 1944. And remember, 3/4 of the victims of the Holocaust were dead by February of 1943. You get a sense of the problem of interdicting this? This was done out here where the prospects of interfering with it were very few. And to give you an idea about the process, I think we mislead ourselves when we talk about factories of death, because it makes it sound like what was done was, you know, hyper-organized, like an efficient assembly line and so forth. These places were disassembly lines, but they were not complicated to establish. Leave Auschwitz aside for a minute. Auschwitz is the one that had brick buildings and a large-scale garrison and so forth. But the camps that killed 2 million people, in Chelmno, Sobibor, Belchec, Treblinka. The first death camps, the first gas chambers at these places, consisted of 2 rows of wood, vertical, with a layer of sand in between and a layer of tar paper on the outside. Can you imagine how cheap this was to construct? And you could run people through those and kill them at a rate initially of about 4,000 a day. And then to give you a sense of how improvised this was, in the summer of 1942, the delivery of people by train to the death camps was interrupted because the Germans needed all the railroad equipment to supply the troops that were marching towards Stalingrad. And the managers of Belchec and Sobibor and Treblinka used the opportunity to turn these wooden gas chambers into stone ones. Where'd they get the stone? The commandant of Treblinka realized that in a little village called Malkinia, which is a few miles away where the railroad line turns off toward Treblinka, he had seen a factory with a giant red brick chimney. He blew it up, and he repurposed the bricks to make the new stone, the bigger new stone gas chamber at Treblinka. Now imagine for a minute how little that cost. It was improvised and easy, and then they brought the people in, and when Treblinka was operating at full capacity in September of 1942, they were killing 10,000 people a day. This was a low-cost, low-overhead, low-tech process, and it was financed entirely with money they stole from the Jews. This did not interfere with the German war effort at all. They used the same railroad cars over and over again, going back and forth, the same locomotives. They were not a diversion from the war effort. When they had the potential to interfere with military operations, the deportations were stopped. So the Germans had this method. Now, what about the Jews? As I said, they were internally divided and largely powerless. One of the things I found over the years, and I taught large classes on the history of the Holocaust, usually over 200 people, a very small percentage of those students were themselves Jews. And so I found myself, there's a very common misconception among non-Jews about Jews, which is they're all the same. And the Jews in the audience especially are laughing at this, because, you know, this is crazy. But Jews in Eastern Europe were divided in a host of ways. They were divided politically. Some of them were left-wing, some of them were right-wing. They were divided about their sense of the future. Some of them saw their future in the countries they lived in. Some of them saw their future in the land of Israel, Zionists. There were Neolog Jews, that is, Reform Jews. There were conservative Jews. There were Orthodox Jews. There were Hasidim, ecstatic Jews. There are all kinds of these differences. In Eastern Europe, all of these factions of Jews had different institutions. They had different traditions. They had different practices. The moment the Nazis appeared on the horizon, these things didn't disappear overnight. These communities were under siege from the Nazis. It took a long time for people who had different worldviews to agree could agree about what are they going to do to us. That took a long time to figure out. And then, what are we going to do in response? And the Nazis, remember, profited from that time, because the onslaught was so intense in 1942, when virtually the whole of Polish Jewry is wiped out, and most of the Jews of Ukraine and so on. The Nazis moved faster than the Jews had time to respond. The other thing I want to stress to you is that everyone else always had something more important to do. And I don't want to talk too long, so I'm going to abbreviate this. I can talk about this in several different ways. First, look at us, the United States. We took more Jewish refugees than any other country on the world between 1933 and 1945. But we took only about 225,000. In comparison to the number who were murdered, obviously we didn't do as well as we should have. Why didn't we? The arguments against admitting Jews are arguments that are going to sound very familiar to you. They'll take your jobs. They'll cost you money. And there will be spies among them. Nowadays we say terrorists. And these were the arguments that were used to say, you can't open the doors, it's too dangerous to let them in. And then beyond that, there was the argument of numbers. The people who were opposed to letting people in before the Holocaust started said, it's not just the 500,000 Jews of Germany, 500,000 people, we can absorb them. But if the Nazis succeed in driving their Jews out, what are the Poles and the Romanians going to do? They have also asked the League of Nations to help them reduce the size of their Jewish populations. If you let in the 500,000 German Jews, you create a precedent, then you have to let in the 3 million Polish Jews, the 800,000 Romanian Jews. This was the boogeyman that was used as an argument against it. And so we decided, most Americans decided, most college students decided. In 1938, 75% of American college students said, don't let in any more refugees, because they'll compete with us when we graduate. And so we all decided that our interests were more important. Let me give you another illustration of that based on my own biography. My full name is Peter Francis Hayes. I think they wanted a cardinal. They could have named me Sean Patrick and produced something a little more Irish Catholic, but that's about it. And I was raised in the Catholic Church, and so I have a take on the silence of the Pope and the passivity, the large-scale passivity of the Catholic hierarchy in the face of all this, which illustrates how important thinking about something else, thinking I have some other obligation that's more important, how important that was in interfering with helping Jews. The Catholic Church that I learned my catechism in part, incidentally, in San Antonio and Houston, because my dad was attached to air bases there, taught that there is no salvation without the sacraments. You cannot go to heaven unless you have access to baptism. I'm going to blow this. Baptism, communion, confirmation, marriage, holy orders, confession, anointing of the sick, the last rites. Have I skipped something? I think there were 7, and I might have just said 6. My catechism was a long time ago. But anyway, the doctrine is there's no salvation without the sacraments. And in Catholic teaching, you cannot get the sacraments unless there is a priest there to administer them. That means there's no salvation without priests. Now, this makes the Catholic Church supremely blackmailable in contexts of dictatorship. Because the dictator can always say, I'm going to arrest the priests and close the churches. And then the very raison d'etre, the reason for being of the Catholic Church disappears, because the Catholic Church is there to save your soul. Where we are right now, this is not the real world, this is the antechamber to the real world, the thing, you're doing a rehearsal. And so you have to have the sacraments in order to get to the destination. And you need the priest. And so you see how this works? The Pope was always extraordinarily cautious in dealing with the Nazis because they arrested priests sometimes, but they never closed the churches. That was the contrast that he drew with the Soviet regime, where they closed the churches and turned them into stables. And so the Pope always pulled his punches. And so did most of the cardinals and most of the bishops in much of Europe. They basically said, we have something more important to do. Our primary job is to save souls. Our secondary job may be to act out the gospel towards suffering fellow human beings, but the primary job is saving souls. And this was true even when it comes finally to the decision about bombing Auschwitz. Because in July 1944, we're finally in a position to bomb the concentration camp. Why don't we? Because it's the same time that the V-1 rockets and the V-2 rockets are raining down on England. And the military planners say it's more important to take out those launch sites. It's also the same time of the preparation, or the landing had already occurred in Normandy. And so making the invasion, the breakout from Normandy had not occurred yet. So making that happen was more important. Military planners were always able to say, and then the last thing that was more important is we have to shut off the Germans' fuel supplies. So we will send planes over Auschwitz to bomb the synthetic fuel factory that is just beyond Auschwitz, but we won't use planes to bomb the camp. Now, the whole point here is the notion that the people responsible always had a higher priority. And that's why nobody stopped the process. For the most part, they couldn't in the early stages, and then when they could, they wouldn't, because they had something more important to do. All right, I hope I've given you the flavor of the book that I tried to write and some sense of how I tried to make the arguments that I did. And there are microphones set up. I'll be glad to answer your questions. Do your worst. Please, just use the mic so everybody can hear you.
Is it working? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sort of scared. The word Nazi, from what I understand, comes from the words national, national. And we've heard this word recently from our leader. Can you comment on that? Because I am worried.
Well, the word Nazi comes from two words. National Socialist, Nationalsozialistisch. Germans make abbreviations for political parties, usually with some form of Z. So there were Nazis, there were Sozis, socialists, there were Kozis, communists. That's where that comes from. Look, the word, I mean, it's political, yeah. I do think that you did hear what I said about we, us, and them. I do think the division of the world along national lines, which are then said to be the same thing as ethical lines, is a very unfortunate thing. I'm not much of a religious believer, but if you are going to take the traditions of Christianity seriously, there is an involvement there is a requirement to love your fellow man and to care about your fellow man. And if you're going to take the traditions of Judaism, then Hillel's formulation is the one, you know. Treat others as you would want to be treated. Everything else is commentary. And so the proclamation of selfishness as a national purpose strikes me as shameful. Does that answer your question well enough? We should be better than that.
We have two mics. If you just raise your arm, then we'll try to get to you.
I'm sorry, I have the mic. So, but my question, and I'm a Christian, and I think you're giving Christians a pass, to be honest with you, on our apathy during the war years. And as a Christian, I'm allowed to say that. And I just want to read a verse because this is the essence of Christianity, or what I believe Christianity should be. It's from 1 John 3. It says, "We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren." And so my question is, why are you giving a pass to Christians who were apathetic during the Holocaust?
I'm not sure I am, but I would say that Christianity is an extremely demanding religion, and most adherents of it fail for precisely by the standard of that text. Most Christians fail to live up to that text because that's a text that imposes a saintliness on us, and most of us can't be saints. I'm trying not to, I certainly didn't mean in the case of the Pope to be giving him a pass, but what I was trying to do is give you a sense of what thoughts were going through his head. The challenge in history is to explain why things turned out a certain way. The danger in doing that is people hear it as saying it was justified. It was okay that it turned out that way. That's not what I was saying. I'm just saying you have to know what people are thinking, and people in different roles in life think in the boxes of those roles. The Pope was also a Catholic theologian, and he thought very much in these terms. But I don't mean, certainly, there's no, and remember what I said about the 225,000? We did better than any other country, and we still failed. That's not giving them a pass.
So I was wondering, as you look at what seems to be the rise of hate crimes against Jews in America and France and so forth in recent years, does it make any sense, or is it worthwhile to compare the anti-Semitism that exists here with with Nazi anti-Semitism, or maybe even jihadist anti-Semitism? And is that even a worthwhile discussion to go through?
Well, I think the roots of anti-Semitism are, whatever the form it takes, are the same. It's this sort of sense that those people have robbed us somehow. Those people have taken away something. In the case of land, it would be the argument about the jihadists, or the kind of people who are contemporary anti-Semites in the United States think that these people are so powerful that they are exerting influence over us, they're manipulating us, and that's dangerous and bad. I think we will learn more about this guy in Pittsburgh over the next few days, But I'm pretty sure that he believed what I just said. And that, so that's common to these various manifestations. And of course, anti-Semitism is a superstition. It's a belief that this tiny, tiny sliver of humanity, you know, they were 0.75% of the German population. They are, what, 2% of the American population? They are a tiny proportion of the people in countries now where anti-Semitism is on the rise, Hungary, Ukraine, Russia, and so on. It's this superstitious belief that this tiny fraction of people can exert superhuman power, and everything bad that is happening can be traced back to them. Well, you know, I mean, that's like believing in astrology. It's worse than believing in astrology. And how do you argue with it? Because it is so irrational. You can't. I mean, you have to, I think what we have to do as a culture is not so much argue with it, but shame it. You shame it into the corners where it used to exist. And the second thing we have to do is, and this is something I meant to say earlier and I haven't, remember what I said, that Hitler did not have a majority of the people behind him in 1933? That 55% of them had never voted for him? But 45% had. And if there's one thing they knew about the Nazi Party, is the Nazi Party hated Jews. And those people did not think that a party running on this platform was by definition disqualified from office. Building up to saying, the problem was not the number of anti-Semites in Germany. The problem was the small number of anti-Semites that allowed this, here I'll invoke the phrase, that allowed these people to get a pass. And that's the other thing we can do. We can be anti-Semites. We can be anti-haters of any kind, in a sense. We can be anti-dehumanizers, anti-demonizers. That's within our reach as individuals.
So regarding the consolidation of Nazi rule of Germany, could you talk to us a little bit about two things? One is the Reichstag fire decree, which reminds me of the alleged coup that helped Erdogan put 200 journalists and 100,000 people in prison. And two, the Enabling Act, which passed only because the Centrum Party, which was controlled by the Vatican, voted with the Nazis and the right-wing Jugendberg Party. So those are two things that early in 1933 gave Hitler essentially dictatorial rule. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, the Reichstag fire occurred in February 1933, and there's a lot of, the Reichstag is the German parliament building. And there's a lot of dispute to this day as to how that fire was started. There was a young Dutch radical who claimed that he had set it on fire himself to create a beacon for the working class to rise up and resist the Nazis. There's some evidence, it's a little fragile, but there's some evidence that the Nazis themselves set the fire in order to create an incident and then seize the opportunity. This nowadays, ironically, would be known as a false flag event. Other side perpetrating it. In any case, the crisis was used by the Nazis to say, we're on the verge of civil war in this country. Because burning the parliament building shows how corrupt and evil our enemies will be, and that justifies us in taking extreme measures to repress them. And the Reichstag fire decree made it possible for the Nazis to control the police force and to begin arresting and harassing their opponents and putting them in concentration camps and so on. The Enabling Act was different. The Enabling Act was passed a month later, and it was established that Hitler had 4 years to rule by decree without the interference of Parliament. And it was passed partly because the Catholic political party voted in favor, but it was also the liberal bourgeois parties that were left also voted in favor. All the communist deputies had been arrested and already put in concentration camps. So the parliament that passed the Enabling Act was a kind of rump. It had been reduced in the opposition. And the only party that voted against it was the Social Democrats. That was not enough to stop it, carried by 2/3 majority, and Hitler had formal parliamentary sanction to rule by decree. Now, one of the things that's very important to notice about that, because I get asked this a lot, about comparisons of then and now. One of the things that's very important to notice is that in 1933, the level of political violence was so much higher than what we have experienced up until now. Things may be on the verge of changing, but the stormtroopers were in the street beating people up. There were political incidents created. There was this massive pressure to arrest and put behind bars political opponents of the leading party. That was much more intense in Germany in the spring of 1933. What we really have to be afraid of now is if the level of violence escalates.
I think that brings it to an end, unfortunately, now. Just a few things before we conclude. Just stay here, because you still have another important task outside, signing of books and selling of books, and I don't want to shorten this too much. But in the meantime, Burton Einspruch is coming up just to thank you again and to express our gratitude for your wonderful lecture.
Well, I appreciate what you had to say. It was not pleasant listening to you, but we all heard it. As a token of our appreciation to you, this is a very small thing. I plan to give you an armadillo, but as some of the doctors here know, it carries a certain type of leprosy, and you would never forget us for that.
I would never forget, no. But I like Tiffany. Good. Thank you very much.